Good. Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of the AltMed podcast. My name's Andrew Dowling. With me, as always, my co host, Mitch Kurtz. Welcome back for another year, Mitch.
Looking forward to it and looking forward to kicking off with a fantastic guest this week.
We do have a fantastic guest. This one's been a little while in the making, but yeah, and I'm not sure. Look, we're saying back for another year. By the time this gets published, it'll probably be 3 months into the year. But anyway, I digress. But we are absolutely thrilled to have joining us today from Legalise Cannabis Victoria. He is a member of the Upper House, the Legislative Council in the Victorian Parliament. It is none other than Mr. David Ettershank. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Mitch. It's wonderful to be with you.
Well, we know there is a lot on your plate. There has been last year and this year, and unlike a lot of people, because you're in the public eye, there's a lot of discussion in newspapers and the like about what's on your plate. But maybe before we dive into all the interesting areas of law reform that Legalise Cannabis is pushing ahead with, can you just give us an overview of your background and how you managed to find a seat up at Spring Street?
Sure. I guess I've been involved in politics and community action for about 40 something years now, and spent 20 years in the trade union movement. The last 20 years working as a consultant in aged care in the not-for-profit sector, doing all sorts of really interesting work. And then we're actually coming up to our 20th anniversary at the firm I'm in with Outcomes Plus, was the company I was a partner in, and things were a bit quiet, and I got tapped to find out if I'd like to receive a phone call to possibly be invited as a candidate for Legalise Cannabis. So I did, and I was pre-selected, and yeah, after a very well planned, super resourced campaign that you were a part of, Andrew, two of us actually got elected, to I think everyone's surprise, including ourselves.
Indeed, it was very much a shoestring budget campaign, but if I recall, yeah, your skirmish. So David, for our listeners, holds the seat of Inner West, so metropolitan Melbourne, and it was neck and neck between you and the Victorian Socialists. But yeah, not for the first time the Socialists didn't get up on this occasion. But yes, we got two from Legalise Cannabis Victoria, and feel like I let down the team by not making the grade. But the good folks of Western Victoria had the wisdom to not elect me. So I'll respect their democratic wishes. But let's dive into what the party's doing at the moment. So even since that election, that great election in November 2022, at that point in time, we had two people from Legalise Cannabis in the upper house in WA, and yeah, tip the hat to Sophia Mormond and Dr. Brian Walker, who've been doing wonderful things in WA. And then since the Victorian election, we had Jeremy Buckingham, if I recall, get elected to the upper house in the New South Wales Parliament. So we now have three states where we have legalised cannabis representation. Can you perhaps, just talk about what the party's sort of key policy areas are, and where you see perhaps the trend continuing in terms of getting more people elected to parliaments at both maybe a state and even a federal level?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think we're in the right place at the right time. That's the underlying political dynamic. And I think we've just seen over the last decade, and building on the back of decades of really hard work by cannabis activists, a fundamental shift in public attitudes to cannabis reform. I think a big factor there's also been the growth of medicinal cannabis, and we might want to come back to that one. But suddenly it's for a lot of people I speak to, it's no longer about images of just young people with bongs. Suddenly it's my sister or my auntie or my mother or my grandmother, who are using medicinal cannabis, and that changes, I think, the dynamic. And so we've come into on the back of what's basically a pretty strong primary vote to secure the seats you've referred to. And yeah, it's very much a feeling that we have that we're really just a voice of a sort of public demand for reform in this sector.
And is it, would you say as well, just with a lot of single issue parties, you know, you have parties that sort of advocate on lower taxes and things like this, and they're kind of ongoing aspirations, but legalizing cannabis is, you know, depending on the extent of it, it's something that could really just happen and come and go. And at that point in time, one would speculate as to the party's existence after this happens. So I suppose you're a rare breed in that respect, in that the party is almost signaling that if this particular policy objective should occur, then we have no reason to occupy seats in Parliament thereafter. I mean, look, for what it's worth, I would love your ongoing role in future parliaments, David, but do you find that that's an interesting aspect to it as well, where perhaps people, when they're at the ballot paper, you know, who do give their vote to legalise cannabis, are saying, we just want to get this done, and then I'm probably not going to see that that party again on my ballot paper in elections to come?
Absolutely. I remember when we were on the early voting centres on polling day, you know, handing out, people would ask us exactly that question.
Yeah.
And you know, there was sort of two alternatives. One was we just add a D to the name, so it's Legalise Cannabis. Please keep voting for us.
Yeah.
But you know, our preferred option is, look, let's just do this.
Yeah.
Let's just do it. You know, it's not that hard as a technical exercise.
Yeah.
The obstacles are cultural. The obstacles are 95 years of prohibition, and trying to break down stereotypes, and just get on with it and start treating it in a normal manner that's premised upon good public policy, harm minimisation principles, and such like. And we've actually said to government ministers and the former premier here, make us redundant.
Yeah.
You know,
please put me out of a job.
yeah.
I don't want to do this anymore.
I'm good for that, you know. And we have this saying, are we a project or are we a party? And we're both, you know, we're both. But at its heart, it's a very well-defined piece of work we need to do. But it does have its complex elements. We might get into that a bit later.
We've seen, you know, the sex party turn into the reason party, for example, things like that. Could you see an avenue for a pivot? It might be slightly more controversial, and it might not be aligned with everybody in the Legalise Cannabis Party, but you know, there's an increasing amount of interest in other alternative natural therapies, such as psilocybin, as an example. I'm not sure that the full Legalise Cannabis Party would all be in support or not of you know, another drug such as that. But could you imagine? Sorry?
Definitely would, I would assume.
Yeah, there is an overwhelming amount of interest in that particular field at the moment. But do you think like pivoting drug to drug is a possible solution, or do you think it is like more viable that the party would turn into something a bit more broad and such as how the Reason Party did it?
I did get a proposal from a member the other day that we get this sorted on cannabis and then we change our name to MDMA. That's standing for more democracy, more autonomy. But yeah, look, I think at this point in time, we're happy just to sort of look at, you know, our names on the tin, Legalise Cannabis. It's going to take time. There's a lot of complexity to the process. Let's get this done, and then let's see where it goes from there.
Yeah, and I think built into the party anyway is just those implied inferences, perhaps, that you're alluding to, Mitch, where, you know, yes, it is cannabis that we're working towards legalization of, but built into that is addressing issues of stigma, addressing harm reduction. So all of that is really kind of bundled in with the key message. So let's maybe.
I just meant it as a gateway drug. to other
No.
parties. No, I'm kidding.
We say exit drug.
Exit drug.
But look, I think we shouldn't be looking at cannabis in isolation. So I mean, one of the things that we were sort of looking at last year is sort of, like, okay, so what are we doing next year? And we started sort of scanning and thinking through issues. And I mean, there was an omission we discovered in the government's framework at the moment in Victoria, which is that there's not a Victorian alcohol and other drug policy. There's not actually a statement that says what is the government's approach to drugs, whether it be alcohol, tobacco, or any of the others that we've talked about.
Yeah.
And so, we're going to run with that this year. We see that as a really big issue.
Because wouldn't that then require them to state expressly that minimizing the harm to Victorians is, absolutely paramount, in which case they would then have to agree to doing things like pill testing and all the things that some members of parliament are ideologically opposed to for no rational reason whatsoever.
Yeah, and so, yeah, I mean, absolutely. And as you're aware, we've been pushing quite hard with the Greens and the Animal Justice Party to try and reactivate the debate around pill testing.
Yes.
You've got, in Victoria, you've got 4 coroners who basically said, do pill testing.
Yeah.
It's not like maybe you should think about it. It's, you need to do this. This is just good public policy.
Yeah.
And I think, Premier Andrews, clearly he was, as a former health minister, perhaps surprisingly, very, very strongly opposed to that. We take some heart from the fact that recently, Jacinta Allen clearly sort of stepped back from that, and there was a bit more nuance in her position, and so we're hopeful that that may well be a useful start to try and address what's an obvious need, to simply basic harm minimisation and let people know what's in their drugs.
Exactly. No, couldn't agree more. Well, let's talk about, so you were busy, you and Rachel Payne, the other MP in the upper house for Legalise Cannabis Victoria, had a very busy first year in office. Certainly made a splash as someone who takes a great interest in reading about cannabis law reform. But some of the areas that where the conversation was started and sort of in train at the moment, we have drug driving reform, workplace drug testing, industrial hemp inquiry. Which direction do you want to go first, David? You've been
we could go right up the middle and talk about personal use. I guess that was the last thing we did for the year. But yeah, you're right. There was a number of elements, because I think we've got a view that if one understands this as a cultural issue as well as a health and a sort of harm minimisation issue, then you need to attack on multiple fronts.
Yeah.
So yeah, look, I mean, on the personal use issue, we before Christmas we moved a personal use bill. It was a bill that was moved for at least its first reading stage. That's when you just start the process in Parliament simultaneously in Western Australia, New South Wales, and here in Victoria. And apparently, according to the Parliamentary Library, it's the first time that's ever been done, that a bill's done simultaneously in 3 states.
Amazing.
And it's pretty simple. It's basically saying let's legalise certain key elements of being a cannabis consumer. So you should be able to grow your own cannabis, half a dozen plants in your apartment, your backyard, whatever. You should be able to have on your person 50 grams of cannabis. You should be able to gift that cannabis to a friend. You can't barter it, you can't trade it. Can't consume it in a public place, and basically that's the guts of it, and we sort of refer to it as ACT plus, because obviously there was the legislation that went through in the ACT, and that was landmark, but there's obviously some issues with that legislation, like for example that you can grow plants. but it's still an offence to acquire or gift seeds, which
Mm.
raises that sort of existential question.
Yeah, how do the plans come to be? If well, yeah, it introduces an aspect of that legislation where a part of what you're doing is legal, and a part at the beginning when you're sourcing genetics is illegal. I did see as well that I think it was a max 4 plants per household in ACT. And I think what's interesting, like I was speaking to someone actually who was involved in the Californian cannabis scene, and they were saying that, yeah, it was 6 plants over there. And if you required more, you could, as a patient, apply to the Californian government for a grower's license where you could grow up to 99 plants. Now, I assume there's some very unwell people in California, perhaps, that might require that quota. But yeah, it just gives you a sense of how conservative that starting position was from the ACT, and that's not in any way to denigrate the policy efforts of those that got that across the line. But clearly, that was all part of the compromise, was having to agree to 2 plants per person. But I think 6 is a very reasonable number, and maybe we should consider for Victoria something similar, where if you're really unwell, you can apply for up to 99.
Well, yeah, look, I mean, that's one issue we've got on our agenda, which is about compassionate use. There is already legislation in New South Wales which covers compassionate use, which is if you've got a terminal condition, you can keep on growing plants. So
Okay.
you've got to register. And I don't think there's actually a limit on the number of plants you can grow, but if you want to grow those plants for your own personal consumption, and you are in a palliation or you have a terminal medical condition, you are exempted from the laws. So we're going to look to replicate that. The other one, though, just stepping back a little bit in terms of the 4 plants in the ACT, one of the conditions there is you can't grow indoors, and you can't grow in a greenhouse. And those of us who have spent precious and beloved time looking after our plants,
yes,
whether it's in the ACT or here in Melbourne, you get to grow 1 crop a year outdoors.
Yeah.
That's it. Like, try and grow a crop in Melbourne in winter outdoors. It's like growing tomatoes. It's just not going to happen. So we're saying, and if you've got an apartment, you don't have a garden, so you've got to be able to grow indoors. That's a really critical failing in the ACT legislation. So we're seeking to pick up some of those issues at the same time. Just common sense, a basic decrim legalisation model for personal use.
Yeah. Just speaking about people who genuinely are seeking personal use for medical reasons, how does the Legalise Cannabis Party view the current medical industry? I'm actually curious to have just a lens on it, out of curiosity.
I think the medical cannabis industry is really important. In the first instance, I think I've already alluded to the fact that I think it's changing people's perceptions of what cannabis is, whether it's CBD based, THC based, or broad spectrum. Clearly, there's a recognition that it's a valid medicinal prescription-based approach, and people should have that on an equal footing. There is a whole question, and I think this has been debated fairly extensively within the medcan sector, particularly amongst the producers and probably wholesalers, distributors, about what's the viability of the sector, or what's the challenge to the sector if there is the ability, if we do go through a stage where there is broad-based commercialisation of adult use. And I've heard arguments on the one hand that that's great. The medcan sector will simply expand its production, and it will meet that public demand. There's another view that, and clearly there's a lot of people in the ag sector who view that they should be able to grow whole crops without necessarily the same level of restriction or control that applies to medcan. And then I think there's also a recognition that probably sitting in the background watching the whole show. And this unpack is, is big pharma and big tobacco, looking at, what opportunities would commercialisation present for them, recognising that they can bring enormous commercial acumen and political and economic clout to the sector. So I think that's going to be a really interesting one to watch.
Yeah, it's definitely. I definitely think that there's a lot of people and that basically know somebody who's got a script or have heard about it, or their friend got it, or they got some CBD oil, or my dad had this condition and he's now taking a THC oil at night, and actually it's nothing bad happened to him. He didn't keel over. He didn't have a psychosis, schizophrenic attack. He, you know what I mean? He felt a bit sleepy, and he probably had, seconds at dinner. But he, you know what I mean? I think as we destigmatize in that way, and people get used to realizing that it's not a big, bad, scary thing, and especially I think there's a huge divide between, call it the older generations and the younger generation coming through. I mean, cannabis is very normalized in the younger generations, as are a lot of what traditionally illicit drugs, to be honest. I think the younger generation is growing up with a series of movies that almost glorify, illicit drug use more than, say, what it might have been when I was growing up, which was more alcohol, types of usage. It was seen as the cool thing to do in even movies back then. So I think that's probably one of those steps to the destigmatization. I'm not sure if you would agree with that analysis.
Absolutely. We hear that all the time, that people saying that family members are using it, and remarkably they haven't transformed into something evil or suddenly developed a heroin addiction. So it is playing a really important normalisation function. And I think it also has the benefit of sort of just practically demonstrating how ridiculous the prohibition model is. Prohibition is premised upon, in my mind, government abrogating any responsibility for regulation. It's just say no, encoded in law.
But it also suffers from and sorry, David, if I can actually just ask to adjust the microphone. We were just getting a little bit of ducking out. If we can just get you to speak
talk into it.
Talk into it more?
If it can be, there we go. That's beautiful.
How's that better?
Yeah, perfect. It's also the just say no mentality seems to assume that they can curtail demand, but saying no and lobbying the government to say no to supply of a given product in no way has any impact on demand. And so you really do just create a black market. All these things are obviously well known to people on your side of politics, but it is, to my mind, just baffling that every day when you go into work, you've got people who are sitting there with you in the chamber that genuinely believe that that's the right policy approach, despite the decades of evidence that it just doesn't work. It as Albert Einstein said, the definition of insanity. So it's crazy to me, but I appreciate that they are your colleagues. You have to negotiate with them on all manner of legislation. So, you have to take them along for the journey.
Well, and can I say, it's been very interesting over our first 12 months, because for us, the first 12 months was as much about just trying to figure out how the place works. Parliament, how do you do law? How do you actually survive in that environment? And also, how do you build relationships?
Yeah.
Because and particularly in the upper house, relationships are very important. And I must admit, I snorted at that when that proposition was first put to me. But I get it now. And it was very interesting when we arrived. There's all these people who would come up to us and sort of go, "Oh, you're with the weeders. Do we need to start hiding the garden hoses now that you're here?"
Oh.
And sort of chuckle. And it was sort of like grit your teeth and just push on forward. And since then, we've obviously had a series of debates around medcan driving, impairment, and of course, finally with the hemp industry inquiry, and then the personal use bill. And it was very, very interesting. In that personal use bill, which was at the end of November, 40 people in the chamber, no one spoke in support of the status quo, retaining the status quo.
Okay.
No one, including from the coalition.
Yeah.
There are a number of people who don't support legalisation. But I think there's also now two things that really struck Rachel and myself. One, that people recognise that the prohibition model really doesn't work. There needs to be a better approach, but there's not a consensus over that. And so that's a really important thing. But the other one is to have a situation now where you've got people of, significantly conservative views able to talk about CBD versus THC, different types of ingestion, So for our colleagues in the upper house, I think there's actually been this really big education that's happened because they've been forced into the debate process.
Well, and you've replaced, the voices from the previous parliament, where in your seat alone, you've taken Bernie Finn's office, the former member for Inner West Metro, who espoused some of the most conservative and religious views. So it's almost like the refresh button for the Victorian Parliament has been hit.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And Ingrid Stitt, the minister who's responsible for alcohol and other drugs, in her response to our personal use bill, basically said, we need to, in the new year, which is this year, Ingrid, need to start a process of conversation with the community and seeking expert input into what and how changes should occur. And so I think that is a big change. And as I am currently sitting in Bernie Finn's ex-office, former office, I can feel the vibes. I can feel the vibes. There's the Bernie ghost screaming at the prospect of such a subversive change to the social order.
Did he leave a Gideon Bible in one of the drawers of his desk, like one of those motels? Or anyway, so a question then is, I guess we've talked about some of the sensible, some of the sensible ideas that underpin the policy platforms that the party runs on. But I want to pivot, just now that we're talking about the conservative side of politics, to the one area where I think you can get them, which is the potential for an economic boost to the state. So I know there was an industrial hemp farming inquiry that perhaps you can speak about, but is your sense that at the very least they would have to concede when running the numbers on revenue earned abroad in the provinces of Canada, some states in America, that it's a booming industry. It gives people employment. It's actually, from that side of things, irrespective of your views on the substance itself, a bit like people can look at the harms of anything really, but is there a marketplace for it, irrespective of whether there's merits to the harm argument?
Look, there's clearly the ability for the government to raise revenue out of legalisation. However, due to section of the Constitution, our federal Constitution, Section 90, most of the money will go to Canberra if there's reform, not to Victoria.
Yeah.
We've done an exercise with the Parliamentary Budget Office, and it's quite clear that they can make $150 million a year just out of fees and levies and such like. But when you're billions of dollars that the government's looking for, this is not a panacea. Well, that said, it's not a cost either.
It's not a cost, and then there's also consumption. The consumption tax. Whether it gets called different things, an excise or whatever they want to call it, that they impose upon alcohol and tobacco. But yeah, there is clearly money to be made, and whilst yes, that money goes to the Commonwealth, might there be the opportunity for a redistribution to states that have legalized? I don't know whether this is cards or the subject of ongoing negotiations with your federal counterparts, but that it just seems to me. I mean, just looking alone in Canada, for example, I can't remember the exact figure, but the medical market, I think, was coming in at total market revenue was under $1 billion Canadian, and then that's spiraled out to 6 or 7 billion Canadian very quickly post 2018 after legalization. So, and they're not that much bigger than Australia. So it definitely should give politicians a bit of and particularly in Victoria, not to throw the Victorian Labor Party under the bus, but we do have the highest debt out of any state in the country. So I imagine they'd be looking at ways to try to plug that gap.
Yeah. I think that whether we actually have the highest debt or not, there's various ways you can argue that one. But there's a big debt. Cannabis is not going to solve it, but let's recognise that it's a very productive sector. It's a rapidly growing sector. I was pleased to see, I think last week, that the Ballarat TAFE has just started the Certificate 3 and Certificate 4 in cannabis cultivation.
I saw that.
So it's just kind of, there's a bit of a recognition there that there's a workforce there, and clearly jobs in regional areas is super important.
Yeah. And I was going to say, I think Ballarat's had that course going for quite some years now.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah. No shortage of teachers available.
Oh, yeah. that was more like on the job, you reckon, Mitch?
Yeah. I think it's just part and parcel with living in Ballarat. No, I'm kidding.
So there is manifestly an industry to be built there. We're very attracted to looking at Canada. They've got an interesting regulatory framework. They have a very similar government system. They have a states-based system. So that's attractive. And also in March, I think it is, they're going to be releasing their 5-year review of the legalisation process. So they've been through a major statutory review of that framework.
Yeah,
which I think will also help to inform the debate here as to how we move forward.
Well, and in speaking to suppliers actually in Canada, one of the things, the feedback that we get actually from a lot of them is that the taxes make it really difficult. They are in a really tricky spot in terms of what's levied upon them by either their provincial government or the federal government over there. So I imagine in learning from, for want of a better term, mistakes of other legalization frameworks, that would perhaps be a factor to be considered. But how, sorry, you go, David.
I mean, we, again, using the Parliamentary Budget Office, which is full of very, very smart people who make very conservative estimates. They put the value of the Victorian illicit market at up to $1.2 billion per annum.
Right.
Premised on about, I think it's 85 tons of cannabis. Now, that's drawing off surveys that could have an underreporting of up to 50%. But even if you take the modest 1.2 billion, if you can take that out of the grey economy, where it's not subjected to, taxation, it's not subjected to workers' compensation, it's all cash in hand, and you can simply transfer that into regulated economy. There's immense benefits. But as is quite correctly identified, you've got to be able to compete against the illicit market. And if you just tax the shit out of it because, here's a new thing that people want, well, and the net effect of that is you make illicit more economical, then it's got the potential to undermine some of the benefits of legalisation. So that's a debate I guess we haven't really got to yet with the government, but I have no doubt that it will arise at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just in speaking then about because I think a lot of our listeners would be aware of the fact that the cannabis regulations that allow for cannabis in Australia to be accessed only via a medicinal route under the various schemes administered by the TGA. In order for there to be legalization, the will of a given state in the Commonwealth could be one thing, but we would need to see that harmonization of Commonwealth legislation over the top to give effect to that. I'm just curious, though, in speaking with your Victorian colleague in Rachel, but also your interstate colleagues, have you looked at models? I know it was proposed in an article, something about a social club model. Can you perhaps just give a brief overview for our listeners as to what that could look like in Victoria?
Sure. You're talking about social clubs?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's all well and good to say, you can have half a dozen plants, grow them in your backyard or spare room or whatever you've got. That's great. That'll work for some people. Other people, it won't. It's not an option. So the question then is, for those people for whom home grow is not an option, how do you get access to good quality, affordable weed? And in Europe and in South America, various places, social clubs is a thing. And social clubs is basically a cooperative that allows people to join the co-op or the club, and they pool their right to grow and assign it to the club. And that club would typically then negotiate with one or more growers, and they would grow crop for the club, which in turn is then distributed back out through its members. And so it's a very good way of getting affordable, good quality cannabis to people who can't or don't want to grow it themselves. And so that's certainly one of the items that we've identified in our list with government to proceed with as part of the reform process.
How far off do you think we are of kind of doing what New Zealand tried and just slightly failed, which is just running a plebiscite and saying, get it in there, you know what I mean?
Can I say, Mitch, after recent referendums, there's probably not a big appetite for that one. I think we need to look more closely at what happened in New Zealand, and we're doing some work on that at the moment. But perhaps taking that point, but also stepping back to a point that Andrew made before.
Sure.
There was last year at the ALP National Conference a totally unpublicised resolution that went through. So this was an amendment to the ALP's national platform. And what that resolution said was that it acknowledged the rapid growth of cannabis for a range of purposes. And it said that the reform of cannabis, given that it's primarily a health and justice matter, was first and foremost the responsibility of the states, and that the responsibility of the federal government is not to get in the way of the states. So that was a pretty big handball pass there, it was pretty.
Well, and do you know what? I suppose the proof of that being, I would say, plausible is that it wasn't the Commonwealth which initiated changing cannabis legislation to enable access to medicinal cannabis. That came from Victoria, and if I recall correctly, Fiona Patten had a very substantial role in that. But it was, I believe, early 2016 that Victoria was the first state to pass the Access to Medicinal Cannabis Act, and that predated changes to federal legislation, which gave effect to what Victoria was trying to do, and so began, like dominoes, all the other states sort of enacting similar legislation. And so, yeah, you can see that perhaps the road to cannabis legalization beyond just medicinal access will perhaps be paved state by state in the same way that occurred for medicinal.
I think that's right, Andrew. And also linked to that, we were talking about the Constitution before, I mean, there is a really challenging issue, which is does the Commonwealth constitutionally have the power to regulate cannabis?
Yeah.
And so, you know, we've got that bill currently before the federal Senate, being sponsored by the Greens, which to give the Commonwealth power is dependent upon the Commonwealth regulating the genes of the cannabis to be able to then do a whole broader regulation of the sector. Strengths to their arm, you know, we will support anything that, you know, that's trying to find the reform, but clearly that's a pretty complex way to try and achieve reform. And of course, it also raises a lot of other questions about if you're going to something that's premised upon your ability to patent genes, who's going to benefit from that, or who's going to be able to most effectively compete in that setting? And that's obviously an issue that I think everyone, including the Greens, are well aware of. But that's the constitutional hook that they're dependent upon to be able to get that up.
Yeah, well, exactly. They've sort of had to look through all the heads of power for the federal parliament and say, right, well, there's a bit of a long bow that we can draw here where federal parliament has the power to make laws with respect to intellectual property. Therefore, we can, you know, set up a national register of cannabis genetics and license that. And yeah, it's an interesting bill. I do, though, think then, you know, could the same argument not be said that, you know, tobacco and alcohol aren't expressly listed as, if I've got to go back to my constitutional law textbooks, but you know, we just have an excise and a form of tax in connection with the supply of those products. And I would think at the very least, the Commonwealth government can make rules and laws that allow them to at least take a clip of revenue from the sale of those products. But yeah, look, the social clubs, though, I find a really interesting concept, and I think you alluded to it before, but there is a precedent for how that might look when one looks to Europe and how these clubs have gone over there. But so in terms then, I suppose, of looking forward to elections on the horizon, there's a federal election which I believe has to be held by no later than May 2025, and we would perhaps think that Albo might not be holding the election as soon as 2024 because he's got lots of public image matters to take care of. But what's your expectation at that election? Might Legalise Cannabis get someone into Parliament in the upper house or in the Senate at that election? Or do we think there'll be just more people getting elected to the upper houses of the state parliaments over the next few years?
I'd like to think it's both. Obviously, in some states, it's more difficult than others. So, for example, in Queensland, my former home, it's a unicameral system. They only have one house, whereas clearly for smaller parties, upper houses where there's different types of voting rather than your small electorates, Queensland's always going to be a very tough nut to crack.
Yeah,
I'm sure we'll have a red hot go in the Senate at the next federal election, and based on our current sort of base polling, which is sitting around 5%, and in some areas well above that. Yeah, we will. I think we'll certainly push that forward. And one of the beauties of election campaigns is not simply that sometimes you get people in, but also it just gives you a fantastic platform to advocate for your particular issues and to seek to influence other candidates on those issues.
Yeah.
So it's got a lot of benefits, and I'm sure that we'll be aggressively pursuing that. We're also very encouraged. I mean, we competed on the last two federal by-elections, Fadden on the Gold Coast, Rockingham in WA. And in both of those, based on very, very modest campaigns, we came in third or fourth.
Wow.
And I think in both cases, actually, I think we ended up a bit ahead of the Greens. In Queensland, I think we were just behind Labor, Liberals, One Nation, all of whom spent a lot of money.
Well, if I recall correctly, didn't the party almost pit Pauline Hanson for her seat at the last federal election in the Senate?
Yeah, it was only I think it's 1,500, 2,000 votes. And, yeah, Pauline Hanson wouldn't be there, and Legalise Cannabis candidate would be. And that's but such is history, Andrew. Such is history.
No, very, very good. Well, no, it's exciting, and yeah, with all the bicameral, the two-housed state parliaments, again, depending on the nature of how the upper house seats are determined. If there's models that allow for minor parties to get a look in, then yeah, we could easily anticipate seeing Legalise Cannabis field some candidates for those seats, and maybe just nab a few more.
That's certainly what we're hoping to do. Yes, absolutely. And clearly this, you look at some of the polling around at the moment. So for example, a couple of weeks ago, there was a poll that came out from YouGov, who, mainstream, very respectable, polling company. And they actually polled on our bill. So our bill for personal use. And just basically, particularly given that the New South Wales and Victorian bills are virtually identical. And that showed 50, across the board, 50% supported, 30% opposed, 20% not sure.
Wow.
Now, and then if you break it up into demographics by age, what it shows is, okay, the only place where there wasn't a majority was over 65s.
Yeah.
And then amongst sort of 18 to 24s, it was closer to 2/3 supported the bill.
Wow.
And, we've said to the government, look at these numbers, and seriously, in terms of your reform agenda for this year, have you got anything more popular?
Yeah, totally.
Don't think about this as hard, as damage control for the government. Why don't you think about this as a really popular reform that a lot of people, including a lot of people in working class and Labor heartlands, are going to be really excited and happy about? Why don't you actually give something to the people who voted for you and for us, something that they can like? And it doesn't cost you anything, and it solves a whole lot of other issues. But that's a conversation we're still working on.
Yeah, there's still, you've commenced taking them along for the ride, and you have to, I'm sure, just continue to speak about these things. But they are very interesting numbers, and undeniably, you would say, without knowing, on my part, but 10 years ago, even those sorts of numbers I would think would be unheard of, and probably largely helped by, and you touched on this earlier, but just the sheer number of Australians that have accessed cannabis for medicinal reasons. But yeah, they're such interesting numbers. And, when you are from that unique position where you're speaking from a party that, wishes to cease to exist, versus speaking to Labor and Liberal, who will, for better or worse, be around for many years. This is a vote winner for them. This is a great way for them to lean into their supporter base. And as you say, it doesn't cost them anything. It's, it's not a huge undertaking, really, when you look at the sky didn't fall in other parts of the world where this has happened. So yeah, we're following with a lot of interest, and we look forward to. I know you obviously wouldn't be at liberty to disclose all your parliamentary negotiations on a podcast like ours. Maybe one day post your political career, but yeah, we know there'll be some very useful discussions to be had, not just this year, but for the remainder of your term.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. We've got we have a sort of a help desk function, I see, if I could describe it that way now, which is a number of colleagues like to talk to us about. Hypothetically, if I had a friend, who was going overseas, and they wanted to take their CBD oil would that friend of mine, have a problem with that? Or, my mum's interested in getting medicinal cannabis, and would there be someone you'd recommend? So and it's like, and there is, and it crosses parties. I don't know if you saw that when we did the personal use bill in December. The Herald Sun, I mean, just did a cracker, which was that survey that I think Mitch Clark from the Herald Sun ran, which was, who smoked weed, and Jacinta Allen came out and said, yeah, I smoked it. And Pseudo said, I smoked it, but, I didn't.
They always say, though, I smoked it when I was at uni. It's like I've not done it in 30 years. It's like, oh, is that why you're so boring these days? No, but they always, I did it. I would have been back in the 80s or the 90s. It's always that response.
Yeah, absolutely. But all of those conversations, and we have a lot of conversations like that, where people say, oh, I had it when I was at university, but, it made me sick. And you go, oh, well, sure. But, like, you probably had alcohol till you vomited as well.
Yeah.
And now that you're older, no doubt there are alcohols you like and there's alcohols you don't like, and you understand the quantity that you should drink and what you can manage. And cannabis is like that. It's not simply buying, getting a joint passed to you at a party. You can actually go and be an educated consumer, and you can select your weed as you would your wine.
Yeah.
And you can enjoy it on that basis. And you can see people going, oh, that's a whole different way of looking at this issue. Yeah. And so, I think we're making progress.
Yeah. It's you see the cogs turning. Yes, I've had similar conversations with people, friends and family alike, but it is all moving in the right direction. But look, we know your time is precious, David. So I think we can wrap up there, unless Mitch had any other pressing questions.
No, I think, as I said, I was sitting by as the dedicated layman, listening to a lot of the discussions, and actually did make sense. And look, we actually haven't had too many parliamentarians on yet, but I think that these are issues that are representative of what the public is thinking about and talking about pretty much daily, and we get asked about this a lot. And obviously, having Andrew run nowhere near as successfully as yourself, David, but
I walked. I didn't run.
He came within a couple of hundred votes of taking the Western Districts of Victoria, and that is pretty bloody good.
Yeah,
bloody good.
No, but it would be remiss of me not to give him a little bit of kick for that.
When you say we haven't had politicians on, did you have in mind someone like Pauline Hanson? Should I put the invitation out to her, Mitch, or who did you think we might get on?
I'm actually trying to think of something witty and clever to say right now, but it's just not really coming to me. I might need something to prop my imagination up. I'm not sure, but no, sorry.
Bob Catter, perhaps. Anyway,
Bob Catter would actually be fantastically entertaining, but I'm not sure he's the target demographic.
Cannabis consumption, we'd cover the field anyway.
I would love to see you doing some interviews with One Nation, because on the face of it, they say they're pro legalisation. But it was very interesting that in the personal use debate, One Nation spoke against.
That's right.
I reckon that could be good. Let's tease it out and find out how strongly are they friends of consumers? Because I know one of the things that really sort of flips out a lot of the big party politicians is the fact that Legalise Cannabis draws from across the political spectrum.
Yes.
So we have people who have very conservative social values but are pro cannabis reform, and we have people who are at the opposite end from the left. But the party does unify those people around the issue of sensible cannabis reform.
Yeah.
So let's find out who our friends are, who our fellow travellers are, and who those who are just running under a flag of convenience.
I like it. Wonderful. No, thank you, Dave. We appreciate your time, and know you're on the cusp of another very busy year ahead in the Parliament. So thank you so much for speaking to us and letting our audience hear from you. I'm sure a lot of people will be following Legalise Cannabis with interest this year and beyond. So appreciate your time, and until next time, take care.
Thanks, mate. It's been fantastic. Lovely to see you, Andy. Lovely to see you, Mitch. And
Thanks,
let's
Dave.
do it again. Catch you later.
Appreciate it.
Sounds good. Okay. Thanks.